Story 1. There is something unexplainable in the forests of Oklahoma. The United States is, no doubt, a diverse land of many different forms of life. From the fierce grizzly bears in the mountains of Alaska, to the stealthy alligators in the swamps of Florida. Wherever you may be, there is always something unique about your state. That is until you get to Oklahoma. You see, Oklahoma is without a doubt one of the most boring places, maybe, ever. Having lived here for 18 years, I'll be the first person to tell you that. Sure, there are large cities, just like any other civilization, however they are spread out over tens, even hundreds of miles apart. What you are left with in between those cities is what some refer to as the sticks or the boondocks or the country, whatever you choose to call it, and that is where I'm from. In the sticks it consists of 4 main elements: lots of trees, lots of crops, lots of wildlife, and the occasional Walmart or Dollar General. Since there is not a lot to do out here, that is where most Oklahoma residents take up the pastime of hunting, and that is where my story begins. It was a cold November night, right in the heart of deer season. I was laying in bed enjoying a video game I was playing, when there was a knock on my bedroom door. It opened, and my dad walked in. "Hey kid," he said. "Yes, Dad?" "You haven't been hunting this season yet. Why don't you take my bow and I'll get you set up, and in the morning you can head out there and go kill us something." Wow, he's really putting me on the spot here. I thought to myself, yeah, sure, why not? I said to him. He told me to dress warm and to meet him outside by the front door in 10 minutes so we could walk out to the spot, so I would know where to go when it was time to leave tomorrow. We began our walk into the woods. With every step we took, I began to get a little bit more annoyed. Where are we going? I thought we were just gonna go behind the house. I didn't know we were gonna have to hike to the hunting spot. Damn, what was I thinking? I should have just said no. When we finally arrived at the hunting spot, we were more than a mile out into the wilderness behind my house. He finally stopped by a huge oak tree and pointed his flashlight at some cedar trees that were off to the side. "Do you see it?" he said. "No," I replied. He walked closer and shined his flashlight into the trees, to reveal a tiny chair that was hidden under some tree branches and sticks. "That is where you're gonna set up in the morning, got that?" I nodded my head as he tossed out some dried corn, to attract the deer in the morning, when I came back. "What time do I need to head out here?" I asked my dad, expecting him to say 6 to 7 a.m. He then muttered, "You need to be up and ready to head out by 4 a.m. My heart sank. It was going to be pitch black outside. There's no way I was going to be able to make it all the way out here in the pitch black. We finally made it back to the house by 11:30 and I headed up to my room, to get as much sleep as possible before this hunting trip. I awoke to the painful sound of my alarm blaring into my dark room. I looked at my phone and it was 3:40 a.m. I sighed and sat up. I put on the warmest clothes I could find and made my way out into the living room. There on the couch sat my dad's bow, 2 arrows, and a small but sharp hunting knife. I grabbed the gear plus a flashlight and made my way out the front door. Navigating the woods at night was an extremely frightening experience that took much longer than what I would have wished. I left my house at 4 a.m. and I did not arrive at the hunting location until 4:37. I was impressed with just how many trees I managed to walk into and how many times I almost tripped over large logs, even with the help of my flashlight. Once I arrived, I sat down in the little uncomfortable plastic chair and began waiting. My dad wanted me out here so early because it makes it a lot easier for the hunter to sneak into his spot and the deer not being able to watch him. I'll never forget the paranoia I experienced in those woods, in the pitch black. The feeling of not wanting to breathe too loud because something or someone might hear you is like no other. After roughly 15 minutes of sitting in the quiet darkness, I heard it. Sticks snapping and leaves crunching. It was a deer walking to my spot. My heart began to pound as I listened closer. The leaves continued to crunch with each footstep, but that's when I picked up on something strange. Is this thing walking on 2 legs? I thought to myself. It sounded just like a pair of human legs walking through the leaves. Is it my dad? I thought. maybe I forgot something at the house. Surely it has to be him. But no, it couldn't have been him. The footsteps were coming from the woods, not the trail we walked. The footsteps emerged from the woods, and stopped. After a short pause, it took one step towards me. A moment later, it took one more step in my direction. I began to get nervous. Deer shouldn't be acting this way. What the hell is this thing? I raised my flashlight up from my lap, and in a moment of pure bravery and stupidity, I clicked my flashlight on. What I saw in front of me still haunts me to this very day. In front of me stood a creature no shorter than 10 feet tall. It stood on 2 legs. It was covered in black fur. The face was human, I believe. The face looked to be of a man's face. The eyes were closed and the mouth was contorted into a sinister grin. It had 2 great big antlers that seemed to come off of an elk or a moose. It had hooves for feet, and its arms were long and skinny but had what appeared to be claws on the end of its hands. As soon as I saw this thing, I clicked off my flashlight, praying it didn't see me. Too late. I almost started gagging from fear when I heard this thing sprinting at me. As fast as I could, I loaded an arrow and drew back the bow. Without hesitation, I fired the bow into the darkness, hoping I could hit the creature, but I missed. I heard the arrow whistle off into the woods before striking a tree. Shit. Stupid idea, I thought. I immediately stood up and began sprinting down the trail. The creature was in close pursuit. I ran faster than I knew I could down this trail. When I was almost halfway home, I began to naturally run slower because of fatigue, and that's when it swiped at me. It hit me directly in my right calf. I stumbled and fell off the trail and into a nearby ditch. Once I fell, and I could immediately feel the warm blood begin to start gushing out of my leg. I quickly tore off my hoodie and wrapped it around my leg as a temporary tourniquet. However, my bleeding leg was the least of my worries. The creature jumped down into the ditch with great force and began swiping at the ground, hoping to hit me. Luckily, the thing landed about 20 feet away from me, so I had some time to spare. I hurriedly pulled out my flashlight and threw it behind the creature. Upon hearing the flashlight hit the leaves, it turned around and began swiping at the ground once again. As quickly and quietly as possible, I crawled out of the ditch. On my way out, I heard the creature begin to make a clicking noise from its mouth. Now I can't confirm it, but I assumed that noise was the creature using echolocation to find me. If this thing is blind, how did it see my flashlight back at the hunting spot? I thought. Then I realized I had to click my flashlight on, and the creature probably heard that. Despite now knowing it was using audio to track me, I still ran to the best of my ability out of the woods. The thing didn't follow me out. I made it home and crashed through my front door, bleeding all over the place. My parents took me to the ER to get stitched up. They asked me what happened, and I told them what happened, but of course they didn't believe me. They assumed I fell while walking through the woods and tore open my leg somehow. And after a while, I began to think the same thing. Maybe I was sleepwalking and fell, maybe I was hallucinating, who knows, is what I used to tell myself. I almost forgot about my experience until today. My dad went out hunting and was supposed to be back 3 hours ago. Me and my mother began to get worried. I walked out my front door. I planned on going to look for my dad, and that's when I heard it. Screaming. I don't know if it was my dad's or if it was just a wild animal, but we called the police anyway, and as I type this, I can hear a faint clicking out by the woods, and if I look hard enough, I think I can make out a human face, looking up at my window. Please, if you are ever in the forests of Oklahoma, be extra quiet. You never know who or what is going to hear you. Story 2. What I experienced in the New Mexican wilderness. This was ported over from an old account of mine with the mod's permission. Before I begin, I just want to say that it may well have just been some kind of strange rabid coyote that we encountered out in the Gila River National Forest, but maybe it was something else. I am not sure what I believe. I discovered Nosleep a few weeks ago after browsing on a few other subreddits. I didn't like Reddit's layout, and I used to prefer browsing on Imgur. Now I understand Reddit is for text stories and Imgur is for pictures. I started reading creepypastas when one came up in Imager's user sub and couldn't get enough of the really good ones on creepypasta.org, creepypasta.com, and the stories here on Nosleep. Then I found one titled Skinwalker deep in my feed one day, and a wave of chills rolled over me. I put off reading it for a long time, but when I finally read it I was both disappointed and relieved. It was pretty good, very good in fact, but the creature described there was just the classic internet horror figure the rake, and not a skinwalker. I decided to record my own experience in as much detail as I could to make sure they are totally differentiated. The rake, Slenderman, Fleshgates, Candlejack, are all one thing, skinwalkers are totally separate. As for real? I can't confirm because in order to do that I would either need video evidence or a dead one, and I have neither. I can tell you what I saw, however, what I experienced, and you can draw your own conclusions. For years ago I was on a camping trip in the Gila National Forest in New Mexico. I am from a small town on the Arizona-New Mexico border called Duncan. Don't worry, you've never heard of it, but now I live in St. Louis, Missouri. When I say small, I don't mean doesn't have a Walmart small, I mean if I stood on my roof I could see where town ends small, but it was a good upbringing, if extremely boring. I had a week off of work and had been planning this trip for months. I was taking a few really good friends back to where I would hike in high school. My best friend Dave, his brother Daniel and his brother's girlfriend Ida, who had long grown tired of the Idaho jokes made her whole life, partially by me and Dave, and now went by her shortened middle name Beth. Obviously, I wouldn't include that last bit if it wasn't important, so keep that in your back pocket for now. We were all experienced campers and outdoorsmen. Daniel had actually met Beth partial hiking the Appalachian Trail, and Dave and I had spent time doing walkabouts in the Ozarks and Smokies, with one trip up to the Boundary Waters where lost a pack in a capsized canoe and had to survive off the land for a few days before we got to someone with a satellite phone. This is important because you need to understand that we all knew our way around the wild. We didn't scare easily and knew that 9 times out of 10 the animals we are afraid of are more afraid of us. Just as an aside, typically these stories are annoyingly vague when it comes to location and details, especially the ones people say are legitimate, so I will copy and paste the plan for the trip below. Any local will tell you that these are real places that people do go while backpacking. The plan was to start from Silver City, go 42 miles north on NM15 and turn left toward Gila Cliff Dwellings National Monument. Continue 1 mile to the West Fork Trailhead. Walk a half-mile back to the TJ Corral Trailhead, climb Little Bear Canyon, then hike down into the Middle Fork Gila River Canyon. Follow the river upstream, and set up camp around the 6-mile marker. After the day hikers are gone, backtrack to the hot springs before dinner. The next day, continue up the Middle Fork to set up camp at the Meadows. I called it Matthews Flats in high school. The next day take the Pryor Creek and Lily Park trails, crossing plateau grasslands to the rim of Hell's Hole Canyon. Take Hell's Hole Trail 268 to West Fork Trail 151, following it 12 miles to the end. There's a great campsite under a rocky alcove near the Hell's Hole Trail junction if we make it there in good enough time. If this story doesn't dissuade you, I'd recommend this backpacking trip, but I won't be going back there. On our first night we made camp exactly where we were supposed to, around 6 miles from the trailhead down the middle fork of the river. We found a nice quiet spot by the river bank about 40 feet from the water. It was dark, and the fire was small but warm, and the food that you make while camping always tastes better than when it is cooked at home. We were quiet, and the stars overhead seemed close enough that if you reached your hand out you could brush them away like sand from a blanket. The only light came from a half-moon hung low in the sky through the scrubby trees and our fire. The euphoric peace was crushed by the absolutely unmistakable sound of coyotes that echoed throughout the trees behind us. Those who have never heard them may think they're basically dogs. They'd sound like barking, but that's not the case. Coyotes cry, they shriek and yap. Some people think they sound like children crying out in pain. Beth heard them first and turned her flashlight to the north. We could tell they were a long way off, but when you hear something like that you instinctively look for a source. Daniel said we should pack up tight tonight, and that we didn't need any scavengers like that getting into our food or trash. We agreed, even though the likelihood of anything getting close to us was very slim. bears had been sighted recently, so it was better to be safe. We repacked anything that could attract unwanted attention and in the process let the fire die down to embers, all the while hearing the crying to the north. It was then we all saw it. A single coyote, sitting in the dark watching us about 30 to 40 yards out of our camp next to a small mesquite tree. We could see its shining, iridescent eyes in the dark thanks to the little fire, and they shined bright like emerald mirrors when flashlights were shined in its direction. We heard his pack to the west again, but he didn't react beyond turning an ear to that direction. Dave asked if he should shoot it since coyotes are vermin around here, but we all said no, it hadn't done anything and may have just been curious. Dave had a .500 Smith & Wesson revolver as black bear deterrent that he kept in a leg drop holster on his left leg. It was getting late and we had a big hike the next day, so after everything was put away, we got into our tents and went to bed. I didn't sleep too well that night, and every time I looked through the mesh window of my tent I saw those two unflinching iridescent orbs in the darkness. The coyote was gone when we woke up. We broke camp and buried the fire. Not disturbing the environment was important to us, and we made sure to leave nothing but footprints. Beth and Daniel were the first to notice something wrong though. The mesquite tree that the coyote was close to was much bigger in the daylight. And there were absolutely no tracks to be found. Dave quickly explained that it was too dry for good prints and the coyote was just probably closer than we thought in the darkness. I wasn't convinced. We were camped on a riverbank, so in theory it should have been at least a little wet, but there was no need to incite a panic over nothing, plus it was gone by this point, so I thought, who cares? We had 2 more days to the plateau with a night at the top, and when we got about a half hour into the hike, Daniel stopped. He was sure he had his knife the night before, but it was now missing from its sheath on his pack. He decided that we should go on ahead and he would run back down to the campsite. It should only put him about an hour behind us, less if we walked slow, and he had plenty of experience on his own. Besides, we got smart and Daniel rented a satellite phone for $50 for the week, so if he got in trouble he could call the park rangers. He said he would be back long before dark when we had camp set up, and he should have been. The trail at that point wasn't that tough. He wasn't. We set up the camp at the meadows, got a fire going, the sun had set and the last light was leaving the sky. The reds and pinks of the sunset gave way to the purples and blues of night. We were discussing whether or not to send someone out to look for him when we heard fast, heavy footsteps. He was running, winded and trying to say something. He didn't have his pack. Bear, I thought, and looked at Dave, who already had his gun out ready to put down whatever came up the trail after his brother. Daniel was gasping for air. He collapsed at Beth's feet, holding himself up with his arms. Beth screamed, asking if he was all right, what was wrong, if he was hurt. Meanwhile, I reached in my pack and retrieved my camp axe. It wasn't much, but it was better than the small 3-inch knife I kept in my hip pocket. Nothing came after Daniel. He was still panting when he turned over to sit in the ground. "It's not a coyote," was all he could say for the next 15 minutes between drinks of water from my camelback and gasps of air. He repeated it over and over. I looked at Dave, who had never seen his brother like this. Daniel was an Eagle Scout and fairly large guy at about 6 feet 2 inches, 200 pounds, and wasn't the type to get spooked by an animal, even a big one. Beth never let go of him as we made food that night. One of the tents, some of the food, his sleeping bag and one of the 2 cooking pans had been in his bag. A day hiker actually found it and it was sent back to him some weeks later. It was torn a bit, but nothing was missing. Always put your info on your stuff, kids. There are still good people left. When he got a hold of himself and was able to breathe normally, he told us what happened, punctuated by deep breaths and a vacant look as he was trying to decide if what he just experienced actually happened to him. He said that he had almost reached the river when he realized how quiet it was. He heard no birds, no bugs, no wind. He barely heard the river, which at this point was little more than a trickle, when the night before it was shallow but at least 15 feet across. He looked up the trail to see the coyote from the night before, but standing on 2 legs like a man 40 feet from him. He said it stood 6 feet tall and didn't dance around at all, trying to stay up like a dog does who is trained to balance on 2 legs. He made it a point to mention that its mouth was closed as it just stared at him. A deep, primal fear seized him and triggered his freeze instinct. He said he locked eyes with it for a minute that seemed like hours, when he finally had the sense to try backing away. No sooner had that thought entered his head did the coyote let out the most unnatural coyote cry he had ever heard. He said it wasn't deafening in the sense that your ears are left ringing, but it was deafening in the sense that that noise is all you can hear even after it had stopped. Daniel wasn't stupid enough to think that he could outrun a coyote, especially one of this size who was clearly not afraid of him, so he had to think quick. He slowly took a step back, fully expecting the animal to charge, but it didn't. Too afraid to look away, he crouched down and felt for a rock, a big stick, something to defend himself with, but there was nothing but small pebbles. It began to move its mouth and Daniel stood up. The animal's eyes rolled back in its head and it slowly opened its mouth too wide to be natural. He showed me a picture of an animal called a thylacine and told me its mouth looked like that when we got back after all this. It's an extinct dog-like thing from Tasmania that could open its mouth to something like 130 degrees. Look it up if you have the time. This obviously put him over the edge. His flight response kicked in and he took off back towards us. An hour away. Running full tilt back down the hiking trail, he heard the cry one more time a few seconds later, as deafening as ever. He heard the shifting of gravel behind him and the sounds of footsteps. The coyote was running after him. Whether it was on 2 legs or 4, Daniel didn't know, but he didn't risk slowing down to look back and see. He was horse-collared by his pack a few feet later. From his knees he slipped it off and ran as fast as he could. He knew the coyote should have been on him within 20 yards, but there were no footsteps behind him. He ran as long as he could before he slowed to a walk. Winded, he turned around to see nothing. He heard a snap in the forest to his right, and he saw it as it reared up on 2 legs again. He couldn't run far, but it was the only chance he had. He stopped to walk whenever he was too tired to run anymore, but every little twig snapping or rustling in the forest became the coyote in his mind, driving him forward. Eventually he could see our firelight through the trees and broke out into a sprint. He said he nearly passed out more than once, and that pure fear kept him running. Obviously at this point our trip was over. We had half the food, and half the tents, not to mention whatever was following us. We didn't have much choice regarding what to do that night though. It was dark and we had to try to hike back out the next day. Daniel wouldn't sleep unless someone kept watch, so we slept in shifts. The tent we had left was a 3-person tent so that Dave and I could keep our packs inside with us as well as other supplies while we slept, so while it wasn't ideal, it wasn't that big of a deal to cram 3 of us in while the other one kept watch. We stayed up between the tent and the fire for an hour and would then sleep 3 hours while the others took their turn. Dave left us his revolver with instructions to shoot to wound, not kill, with the first shot, but not to hold back if any follow-up shots were necessary, just in case we were shooting at something that wasn't our coyote. God forbid we should shoot a person hiking the woods at night for some reason. He took the first watch. Beth took the second and I took the third. Beth woke me up at about 1:30 a.m. She was visibly scared. Before I could say anything she put a finger to her lips and then covered her mouth with one hand. She was silently crying and looking at Daniel. I got up out of the tent and looked around. The forest was still except for the wind in the trees. The wind blew the tall grass and it bent as if an invisible hand brushed the tops of the blades. Visibility was obviously limited, but we could see the tree line surrounding most of the meadow. Beth and I silently looked at each other and the surrounding area for 5 minutes before speaking. I wondered why on earth she woke me up instead of Daniel when she finally spoke. In a low whisper, she told me I heard my name with tears still slowly rolling down her cheeks. Trying to remain rational, I told her it was okay, we were all shaken up, and that the wind bending branches could conceivably make a bass sound and blowing through leaves could make a th sound, forming Beth. She was shaking her head. I didn't hear Beth. The hairs on my neck and arms stood up. She swore she'd heard Daniel's voice coming from the trees calling her real name. She looked in the tent to see if he was still there, and when he was, she was too afraid to wake him. I stayed awake with her for the remaining half her shift trying to hear what she heard, but the only noise came from the occasional bug and the sound of the wind. After a long while she settled down enough to be able to at least try to go back to sleep in the tent. We were so focused on listening that when it was my turn to take watch on my own, the fire had died down to almost nothing. This gave me something to occupy my time after Beth went back in the tent though, so that was okay. Unfortunately, rebuilding the fire took less than 15 minutes and was left with nothing to do but be alone with my thoughts for the remaining 45. This was the first time I really had to think about what was happening and how ridiculous it sounded. I believed them though, Beth and Daniel. Growing up on the border of New Mexico gave me countless opportunities to talk with native Navajo people. I knew that what was out there perfectly fit the description of a skinwalker, an evil Navajo medicine man who had inherited the ability to shapeshift into different animals if he wore their skin. I had seen some weird stuff in the desert as a kid, but nothing like what Daniel said he saw. We weren't that far from the what we called the reservation, so it made sense, but they didn't actually exist, right? Plus, I was told I didn't have to worry about them. A native kid I went to high school with told me that, as ridiculous as it sounds, they can't hurt white people. But now I obviously wasn't sure. I thought it was just superstition, so I never asked how to actually fight these things. I began to fear an encounter. What if it actually was real? If so, why did it want us? What would I do if it attacked? Would bullets hurt it? If not, what then? Would I die out here in the wild, victim of some kind of ancient ritual? My fear turned to dread. How would it kill me? My death was inevitable in my mind. We could call the rangers or police or something, but it would take them hours to reach us, minimum. By then it would be way too late. Looking back now, I'd think I was being irrational, but I now know that a sudden, deep-rooted fear is a sign of a supposed skinwalker nearby. My shift was almost done. I had almost forgotten about the gun beside me on the log I was sitting on. I almost didn't hear it. A twig snapped, off in the brush. Through the waves of heat and sparks escaping the fire, two iridescent orbs shone amidst the darkness of the meadow before me. My heart was in my throat. I shot up off the log and raised the gun. The eyes disappeared into the dark. Did I imagine it? Was I so afraid of this thing that I had envisioned its eyes locking with mine through the flames? The cry almost 90 degrees to my right shattered my thoughts. It couldn't have moved that far, that fast, could it? Was there more than one? It sounded like a coyote, just one, high-pitched shriek, but that wasn't the only sound there. Over a year later, I would be at an outdoor concert. I was one of the first people in the gates, and the sound tech had not muted one of the mics on stage. When a gust of wind blew through the empty amphitheater and reached the mic, I froze. The low, quiet rumble of the wind emanating from the subs that shook my core froze me in my tracks. That's as close as I can come to describing the noise beneath the singing shriek of what I heard. I turned. There off to my right, standing upright, was the thing. Its forelegs weren't raised in a bed position like a dog does when they stand on their back legs. They hung awkwardly downward in front. Its mouth was closed as it stared me down from the tree line some 90 feet away. I heard Daniel gasp in the tent next to me. He knew it was back. Beth stifled a scream through her hands. Through more sheer terror than I had ever experienced, I unloaded 3 shots in its direction, forgetting all about the aforementioned plan to shoot to wound. The gun kicked way harder than I anticipated, and at least one of my shots flew far into the treetops above the creature. I think I hit it with 1 shot though, because it took a step back on 2 legs. I saw its mouth open then. I saw every tooth on its bottom jaw, and they were all pointed at me. The animal shook its head once, and then, with speed unlike anything I had ever seen, it ran straight across the meadow right for me, still on 2 legs. The others came pouring out of the tent now, as all of this had taken place over the course of less than 20 seconds. I fired again before it took too many steps, and for sure hit it this time in the chest. After this hit, it dropped down on all 4s and jerked 90 degrees and took off in that direction. It ran toward the tree line behind the tent and picked up speed as it disappeared into the tall grass. I fired 1 more shot where I thought it would be before Dave yelled at me to stop. The revolver was a 5-shooter and he didn't have much ammunition. He thought he would only use the revolver against bears and figured if you can't put the bear down in 5 shots, it's over for you anyway. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. Its image haunts me to this day. It pops up in my head from time to time and I can't help but dwell on the living image in my head. Eyes rolled back, mouth open too wide like a thylacine as it gave a cry from another world. I gave the revolver back to Dave and he reloaded with what little ammo he had left, just a small pocket-sized 20-round box with only 15 left before he reloaded. None of us slept again that night. We packed up camp and waited by the fire until first light. The plan was to begin hiking as soon as we could see and call the park rangers to get out and meet us on the trail as soon as they could. We knew it would be more than days hike, but if the rangers could meet us on quads or ideally a truck, we could get to the imagined safety of the trailhead quickly. We called and told them we had been attacked by something in the night. It turned out that the guy who answered, Roderick, was Navajo, and got real quiet as we described what we saw. In a very serious tone, he said they'd bring out 2 side-by-sides, and that they'd get out in the next few minutes. He also told us that if we saw it again, not to look it in the eyes. He said he knew what it was and that we were lucky a few bullets deterred it for now. Hiking back down the trail, we were all extremely on edge. Every movement in the corner of our eyes was the thing. All of us had weapons out, silently walking, eyes constantly scanning. Dave, who was in front with the gun, stopped momentarily, causing all of us to stop. Not 10 minutes from our camp was the body of an elk. It wasn't torn in half, its entrails didn't spill out all over the trail in a bloody mess. The skin was gone, and the head, and something had eaten much of the top rear leg, but it was largely untouched by the scavenger animals of the forest. We would have heard a hunter the day before, and no trophy hunter would leave the carcass in the middle of a trail. I don't even know if it was elk season. I think that thing wanted us to find it. Wanted us to know what it was capable of, what it planned to do to us. We didn't see a single animal the rest of the hike, living or dead. When we heard the motors of the side-by-sides heading up to the trail, we all breathed for what seemed like the first time since we broke camp. Roderick was driving the first one. He asked if we were all okay and if we had seen it again. We said no, but we told him about the elk, which he completely brushed off and told us to get in the vehicles. He didn't really want to talk about what he thought it was, but I knew. He had us fill out a report upon getting to the ranger station, but told us to hang around there for a few minutes. He walked out of the station with us and told us that he didn't know what exactly we saw because he wasn't there, but to him it sounded like something that his people don't talk about because they get power from the verbalization of their name, that they feed on fear. He also told us that it would make him feel better if we received a blessing from a good medicine man on the res. Beth wanted to go, but the rest of us just wanted out of New Mexico. Roderick drove us to our car and we spent the next 3 days with my family back home. After that we drove to Phoenix and flew back to St. Louis. I still wake at night when I hear coyotes crying. They live in the woods behind my house. I always go back to sleep when I realize that they are just coyotes and nothing more, when I don't hear the chest rumbling whisper beneath their cries. I still hike and backpack, but it took a while to get back out. Out of the hundreds of times I have been out, this was the only time I had ever been attacked by anything. I have gotten into Native American paranormal sightings since I left New Mexico, because if skinwalkers are real, and I'm not necessarily saying they are, we may have simply been attacked by some kind of rabid coyote that learned to stand, and at this point I almost believe it. If they are real, why not Wendigos, why not the Whistlers, why not Sasquatch, the big water snake, or the Piasaw bird? Unfortunately, there's not really a satisfactory ending to my story, because it's not a story. It is reality. There is no edgy cliffhanger or goosebumps-inducing final line. That's it. That's my story, and if you have one, I'd love to hear yours.